Many of you are happy that you were not the reader of the first of the Old Testament reading this morning. Thank you, Betty. Thank you, Betty. So from despair to celebration, we could also say from fear to courageous acts. This sermon is a sermon adapted from a sermon by the Reverend Dr. Quincy Brown. So when I was 6 years old, my mom put me in swimming lessons. She did this for all 7 of us. And you see, she never learned how to swim, my mom. And she wanted her kids to be able to enjoy the freedom of the water. My cousin, David, I had 72, so you're gonna, there were so many. My cousin David, who I will tell you, I thought was a heartthrob, even to my 6-year-old sensibilities, was my swim instructor. And I was terrified of the deep water, which was odd because I'd been around water all my life. Mom used to take us every summer to paddle around in the public baby pool, and we even had spent time at lakes in the summertime. But when David told me I had to jump into the deep end of the pool, absolute terror overtook me. I can feel it today. I remember. I was literally frozen to the spot. I could not jump in. And David finally, after a few weeks of this, pushed me in. I was shocked and surprised and probably a little more than panicked. And needless to say, I failed my swimming course that summer. Yeah. And David and I had to work this out between his 19-year-old self and my 6-year-old self. David felt like a heel. But at some point, it clicked. 2 years later, when I was just 8 years old, I had climbed up the ladder to the high diving board, 12 feet in the air, and with some encouragement from the lifeguard on duty, I jumped, swam to the ladder, and jumped over and over again. To my sheer delight, right? I was so excited. And I can recount this story to you today when I can't really, honestly, recount many childhood stories because the experience of the deep water scared me to death. So our gospel today finds the disciples with a similar struggle. Jesus is teaching on the western bank of the Sea of Galilee, and the crowd grows so large that he has to use a boat as a makeshift teaching platform. Jesus is preaching the good news of God's kingdom, wanting people to put into practice, remember we're in the season of Pentecost, put into practice the words that he's saying, and people are following him. The crowds are growing large, and Jesus teaches in parables, and sometimes people understand it, and other times people don't. So he explains it to them. And later that day, perhaps exhausted from exerting himself, he pulls his disciples aside and says to them, "Let's cross over to the other side of the lake." So following Jesus' request, they set sail at the widest point of the sea from the west to the east, heading for the other side. And no sooner than they begin to sail across the 13-mile lake, Jesus falls asleep. Now I can imagine the disciples talking amongst themselves, perhaps engaged in figuring out what the parables meant that Jesus told on the shore. Perhaps they're wondering what's going to happen once they get to the other side of the lake. Is it going to be more of the same? Are there going to be more crowds pressing in on Jesus and demanding his time and their time? Before they could answer any of these questions, it happened. The swirling hot air rose. The cool air fell in the area to transform the calm sea. And without warning, the waves began to blow and the calm sea began to get choppy, really choppy. Huge waves started to toss the boat back and forth. And what began as a simple request to cross to the other side of the lake was now the perfect storm. It scared the disciples to death. Some of the disciples on the boat were expert fishermen, and they've navigated through the Sea of Galilee's storms before, but this time it was different. The waves were so turbulent that water began to flood into the boat, and sheer panic set in. They feared for their lives, and all the while, Jesus is asleep. And they shake him as hard as they can. Teacher, 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 don't you care about us? Don't you care that we are about to die? And I can imagine Jesus rising to assess the situation. The Bible tells us that he calmly speaks to the wind and the waves, silence, be quiet. And just as fast as the storm started, the winds abruptly died down. The sea began to get calm again. And Jesus looks at his disciples and asks, "Why are you frightened? Don't you have faith yet?" And the disciples are puzzled, asking themselves, "Who is this guy? Yes, we know he can give parables. We've even seen him do some of the things that only God could do. But we've never, ever seen anything like this. He talks to the water and the wind, and they obey him." Now, in our reading from 1 Samuel, we find young David completely fearless. How can this boy be so assured of the Lord's mantle of protection over him? The story stands in opposition to the disciples in the boat with Jesus. And I'll say that again. They're in the boat with Jesus. While David doesn't have the actual Son of God walking with him toward the Philistines, his courage that shows us that he walks in deep faith, that he will be covered by God. David is victorious due to his skill, right? His skill and his absolute trust in God. His faith saves him. So now we'll turn back to Mark. Jesus was asleep during a storm in the disciples' lives. Now, I don't know about you, but this is where I find two troubling aspects of the text. You see, if I were in the boat, my fear of water would appear. I didn't tell you I have a great fear of drowning. And I would relive my swim class experience of fearing sinking to the bottom of the pool. And I would feel that I'm about to drown. And it doesn't seem that Jesus is that interested in what's going on in my life. Maybe you've had that same experience. Perhaps you're experiencing now something that you're struggling to keep your head above water. And you can't figure out why God is silent. Where is God in the midst of your storm? And perhaps, like the disciples, you shake your fist at heaven and yell at God, "Don't you care about me? I feel as though I am about to die. Why don't you come to me? And why don't you come and see to me?" And the second thing that's personally troubling, and it seems kind of strange, is that it's Jesus' idea to cross to the other side of the lake in the first place. What was he thinking? Was he only thinking about himself because he was tired? But what about the disciples? Are there times where it feels that maybe you've gotten the short end of the stick? Perhaps you're waiting on something that you've been praying for a really long time, and all you've heard is a deafening silence where nothing happens. Maybe you're praying for a miracle, and you've prayed without ceasing, even petitioning your A-list prayer warriors to intercede on your behalf. But still, your prayers seem to go unanswered, and like a rubber ball, they bounce off the floor and the ceiling, and it seems never to reach heaven's gate. But of course, there is good news in this text. The fact that Jesus tells them to cross to the other side of the lake suggests that he will be present with us when we are crossing over the obstacles, the problems, and in certain situations in our lives. And just as I learned in swim class, the disciples also have to face their fear and cross to the other side of the lake. With Jesus asleep in their boat, they must cross over through the choppiness and the disorder of chaos, where the sunny skies turn dark and gray, where angry clouds show up suddenly, to a place of tranquil and still waters that run deep. Like the disciples, I've shaken my fist at God before shouting, "Don't you care about me?" But all along, I was focused on the wrong thing. It's so easy to get distracted by the storms and forget that Jesus is in the boat. Faith says that if Jesus is in the boat and the boat is going through a storm, if we're able to step back and look and get out of our triggered fear, do you know that's what that is? Triggered fear, there's a good chance that Jesus will calm all of our storms. And if we're in the presence of Jesus, we'll be okay. We might get a little wet, we might get a little soggy, but we will be okay because of the one who created the sky and the sea, the one who was with creation when the earth was formless and void and darkness covered the face of the deep. But the Spirit of God hovered above the waters, and God said, "Let there be light." So perhaps this is a creation story for our faith. I know it is with me when I get down, when I get distracted and focus on the storm instead of Jesus. I get exhausted and I fret. I get tired and I need a little rest. Know that in your most difficult days, when the storms of life are raging, Jesus is the one who's in your boat. At this point, I want you all to look up at the ceiling. Do you know what this is the underside of? Do you know what it's the ribs of? What's it look like? A boat. Yeah, we're in the boat. We are in the boat. So maybe he's asleep, but he's still in your boat. And I would rather have a sleeping Jesus in my boat than being on a large luxury cruise ship out in the middle of the ocean with all the amenities, particularly when the sea gets rough. So what about you, friends? Is Jesus in your boat? The boat represents your life, obviously. Maybe your boat has drifted away from Jesus. Maybe at one time you were close to Jesus, but today you feel like he's miles away. Perhaps that's what it feels like for Jesus to be asleep in your boat. But the good news is that Jesus is never too far away from us. Will you call out to Jesus? Will you trust Jesus when things get out of hand? Will you call when your boat begins to shake and it feels like you're ready to sink and drown? As you cross the obstacles and uncertainty and places of uncertainty in your life, can you call out to the one who can speak peace into your life to say, "Winds, calm down. Waves, stop"? I do know how to swim, and I've placed my faith, hope, and trust in the one who sleeps in my boat as I cross to the other side. And those who have ears, let them hear. Amen.